Friedrich Nietzsche is one of the most misunderstood philosophers in history. Many people believe that he simply despised the weak, who promoted a brutal view of life, where only the strongest deserve respect. But is this true? What Nietzsche called weakness was not just the lack of physical strength or power. For him, weakness was something much deeper and more dangerous, a mindset that holds us, prevents us from evolving, and makes us live in constant self-deceit. And here is the scariest part. This weakness is not just in others, it may be in you. Stop and think. How many times have you settled with a situation that made you unhappy? How many times did you lie to yourself, saying that everything was okay when, in the end, wasn't it? How many times have you used excuses to justify your lack of action? Nietzsche believed that weakness was first and foremost dishonesty with himself. And that is exactly what we will explore in this video. Let's understand why Nietzsche saw weakness as a moral and psychological danger, how weakness can disguise goodness and even compassion, why modern society encourages us to be weak, and how to resist it, and most importantly, how to overcome this mindset and develop real inner strength. If you have already wondered why Nietzsche was so radical against weakness, get ready. This video can change your way of seeing life. Now, to understand this idea of Nietzsche, first we need to answer the following question. What exactly did he mean by weakness? When we think of weakness, the first image that comes to mind may be that of someone physically fragile or emotionally insecure. But for Nietzsche, weakness was not just a matter of physical strength or self-confidence. For him, true weakness was a psychological and moral state, a way of misleading, avoiding reality, and hiding behind comfortable illusions. Nietzsche believed that many people do not deal with the truth about themselves. They say they are happy when deep down they are frustrated. They convince themselves that they didn't want anything simply because they failed to conquer it. They prefer to believe that the world is unfair to admit that they did not do enough to change their own lives. This lack of internal honesty was for him one of the lightest signs of weakness, and this mindset generates another even deeper problem: resentment. Weak people, in Nietzsche's view, tend to blame others for their own failures. Instead of taking responsibility for their choices, they seek external villains to justify their dissatisfaction. Someone who cannot achieve power starts to demonize those who have them. Those who fail financially begin to say that success is only possible for the corrupt. Those who cannot change their own lives begin to preach that sacrifice and renunciation are the true virtues. All of this is part of a psychological defense mechanism. Instead of recognizing one's own weakness, one transforms its impotence into a new morality. This morality of the weak, according to Nietzsche, not only distorts reality, but also stifles life. He saw weakness as a denial of existence, a fear of facing the suffering and complexity of reality. For him, many philosophies and religions promote this kind of mindset by encouraging renunciation of desires, pleasure and instinct. But who really has strength, according to Nietzsche, does not escape life. On the contrary, he sees her head on, with all that is good and bad in it. And perhaps this is the most uncomfortable part of this thought, to realize that weakness may be within us. How many times have we chosen comfortable lies instead of difficult truths? How many times do we stop acting for fear of failure? How many times do we despise the success of others just because they remind us of what we couldn't achieve? For Nietzsche, recognizing these standards is essential, because if we do not take control of our own existence, we end up becoming weak without even realizing it. But there is an even deeper look in this view. Nietzsche did not see weakness just as an individual problem. For him, weakness corrupts even how people see morality and values. And that leads us to an even more uncomfortable question. Can weakness become dishonest? Nietzsche believed that weakness was not only a problem of lack of strength, but also of dishonesty. For him, many people choose to fool themselves because facing the truth requires courage. It is easier to tell yourself that everything is fine than admitting that you need to change. Easier to blame others than to take responsibility. Easier to accept a bad destination than having to fight it. This self-pride manifests itself in many ways. There are those who accept a life they do not want, but convince themselves that this is how it should be. Others look at those who succeed and feel jealous, but instead of admitting this feeling, disguise with contempt. Nietzsche saw this as a destructive psychological game, where the person lies to himself to avoid suffering of truth. The problem is that this mindset not only weakens us, but also keeps us trapped in cycles of frustration and stagnation. Those who are not sincere with oneself can never really grow, because they will always find justifications to remain exactly where it is. And over time, this kind of weakness can turn into something even more toxic: resentment. Resentment, according to Nietzsche, arises when someone feels it was wronged, but instead of facing the situation, it becomes bitter and spiteful. He believed that this feeling was one of humanity's greatest destructive forces because it transforms weakness through virtue and strength into sin. Instead of admiring those who have conquered something, the resentful seeks ways to diminish them. Instead of trying to improve your own condition, you prefer to destroy who is above it. For Nietzsche, this was the root of many ideologies and moral systems. Not a sincere search for truth, but a way to justify its impotence itself. And that's exactly why he saw weakness as something dangerous, because it is not limited to the individual but spreads, shaping entire societies. When weakness is ideal, it prevents people from seeking growth, transformation, and overcoming. In the end, this kind of mindset not only imprisons those who follow it, but also attacks those who dare to be different. Nietzsche saw resentment as one of the greatest dangers to the human spirit. For him, weakness in itself was already a problem, but when combined with resentment, it became even more destructive. The resentful not only feels inferior, but also begins to believe that everything that cannot achieve should be despised. He doesn't struggle to be better. He tries to lower what is big so that nothing seems superior to him. This is what Nietzsche calls slaves' morals, a kind of morality created not to raise people, but to justify their impotence. In his book, Genealogy of Moral, he explains how this reversal of values arose historically. Dominated and resentful peoples, without power to overcome their oppressors, began to reinterpret reality. As they could not be strong, they decided that weakness was a virtue. As they could not take revenge, they decided that forgiveness was the real greatness. As they could not be pleasure, they began to say that pleasure was sin. Thus, values such as courage, ambition, and self-sufficiency were being demonized, while submission and conformism began to be seen as noble qualities. But Nietzsche didn't just talk about history. He saw this same dynamic happening everywhere until today. Resentful people continue to invent justifications for their weaknesses. Those who have no financial success say that every rich is dishonest. Those who can't find love say relationships are just illusion. Those who do not conquer anything say ambition is empty. Thus, the morals of the weak remains alive, transforming failure into purity and success in corruption. Nietzsche was not saying that all weak people act like this, but he believed this mindset was dangerous because he spread easily. It is more comfortable to believe that the world is unfair than accepting that it may be necessary to change. It is easier to demonize the success than striving to conquer it. And above all, it is more convenient to say that being strong is wrong than admitting that it is weak. This kind of thought is addictive because it protects the ego. Instead of facing reality, the person creates a version of it where his weakness becomes noble. And that's exactly why Nietzsche saw the morals of the weak as one of the greatest threats to the human spirit. For instead of encouraging overcoming, it imprisons people in a cycle of conformism and self-sabotage. Few concepts are as universal as the idea of compassion. From an early age, we learn that helping others, empathy, and taking care of the weaker are noble qualities. But Nietzsche saw compassion in a very different and deeply controversial way. For him, compassion could be destructive, both for those who receive it and those who offer it. He believed that compassion was often not a genuine act of kindness, but an instrument of manipulation. When someone puts himself as a victim for pity, in Nietzsche's view, this person is not just looking for help, he is trying to transfer his responsibility to others. Instead of taking on his own destiny and fighting for herself, she rests on the compassion of others as a way to remain weak without having to change. And this criticism also extended to those who offer compassion. Nietzsche saw many acts of charity and mercy as forms disguised on superiority. When someone feels sorry for the other, they are somewhat reinforcing the weakness of that person and reaffirming their own position of superiority. For him, true greatness is not in feeling sorry for the weak, but in encouraging them to strengthen themselves. Nietzsche believed compassion could become a vicious cycle. If we help someone without encouraging them to grow, this person may end up dependent on help without ever developing their own strength. He saw this as a subtle form of imprisonment, where the weak remains weak because they always find someone willing to support them. This does not mean that Nietzsche defended cruelty or indifference. On the contrary, he valued the idea of magnanimity, a kind of generosity that does not reinforce weakness but inspires strength. For him, true support was not the one who simply offered comfort, but the one who challenged the person to become stronger. Nietzsche's view of compassion is one of the most controversial of his philosophy. It forces us to reflect on the difference between helping and feeding dependence. How many times do we offer compassion just to feel superior? How many times do we accept the piety of others as a way to avoid responsibility? And especially, are we really helping people when we save them from the need to grow?